All right, let's go way, way back on how Star Tours began. This was back in the mid 80s, early 80s, and we were starting to realize that Disneyland was a little bit out of touch with the films that were becoming really popular with younger people in that era. So in 1977, of course, Star Wars came on the scene, and it was followed by Close Encounters and Indiana Jones and E.T. And the Disney movies were charming, but they were more for children, little babysitter movies like, The Fox and the Hounds and the Aristocats and all that. And they weren't the kind of films that Walt did with Cinderella and Snow White, and they weren't the films that have come about since this time, like Beauty and the Beast and Little Mermaid, and where we once again were creating films that both adults would like and children liked. But that wasn't happening in the 70s. And so I went to my boss, Marty Sklar at Imagineering, and I said, we're in danger of becoming out of touch with where kids today are growing up. And where I see the problem with that is as they become older and they want to share Disneyland with their children, they won't think about it in terms of a place that holds all the memories they had of childhood, because those might be Star Wars, they might be E.T., they might be Indiana Jones, and those things don't exist here. And until Disney recaptures that with film, we need to be creating Disneyland as the place where you find the greatest of all popular culture things of all time, so that every generation finds something at Disneyland that really takes them back to being that, that child person. Like, so if you hear John Williams music while you're in the Star Wars, loading area, that is like a touchstone that takes you right back to when you heard that in the theater the first time. So Marty said, that's a great idea, but you realize, of course, you're sort of in a roundabout way saying to the studio that they haven't come up with anything that does what you're saying these other people have done. And that's going to be hard to put on them. That's like saying, well, the Black Hole and Island at the Top of the World and the Black Cauldron and all these movies weren't that good. Even Tron, Tron was expected to be a big property for Disney, and it looked good, but the story didn't grab anybody. So they were struggling, and I pitched it to Marty and said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll get a meeting for you to go over and talk to Ron Miller, who was head of the studio. He had married Diane Disney, and then Walt said, you've got to get a job where you're going to be safe, and that's at the studio. I don't want you playing football, because he was a big, very powerful man, and he had been, I think, at SC, and I think he was playing for the Rams. And so Walt said, if you're going to have my grandkids, you have to have a safe role. So he started with the studio, and then Ron worked his way up to running the company, the film division of the company. So I went over there, and I knew Ron. We had had a lot of interface before, and I had to delicately say, I didn't say the Black Hole and these other films wasn't successful. I just said, that these films that George Lucas and Steven Spielberg have created have captivated the world the way that Walt Disney did, and they also will tell you immediately that Walt Disney was their hero, and that they grew up inspired by his films, and that's sort of what has spawned them on to do what they've done. So Ron, he said, well, if the Black Hole had been first, it would have been a different story. And I figured, okay, I'll give him that. I'll say, yes, Ron, you're right. Had the Black Hole come out before Star Wars, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I don't actually think that would have been the case. But anyway, it was a way for him to feel comfortable with my statement that essentially Disney hasn't created the kind of iconic stories that need to be in Disneyland. So he said, here's what I'll do. Ron owns a winery, or owned a winery, the Silverado Vineyards up in Napa. And he said, it's not far from Lucasfilm, so why don't I arrange for George to meet us at the ranch? We'll have some lunch, and we'll talk about this. So I left the studio that day, and before long, in a couple weeks, and this would have been about I think it was in 84, in that range, I get the call, we're all going up to this to the Napa Valley to Silverado, and it was myself and Marty Sklar and Rick Rothschild, and then George would meet us there with Ron Miller and Diane Disney Miller. And so I remember we got there and Ron gave us a great tour of the winery, and then George drove up in a BMW. And before I knew it, we're in the kitchen and Diana's saying, help yourself to the salad and the potatoes and all that. And there's plenty more in the refrigerator. And I'm sitting there going, this is Walt Disney's daughter that's telling us to help ourselves with a salad. And this guy, he's the head of the Walt Disney Company. And here is George Lucas, who's revolutionized the world of entertainment with Star Wars and American Graffiti, and Indiana Jones was out by that time too. And so I was sitting there going, what am I doing here? Why am I here? It was a very both humbling and exciting thing to be around these people, and they were all just so normal, eating lunch and talking. And I remember George drove the car himself, and hi guys, and so we talked about it, and George, I presented a different concept. It was a concept of it being kind of a roller coaster thrill ride with some choices in it. And George said, well, I think of my company, Lucasfilm, as an A1, really great corporation. And in terms of theme parks and whatnot, Disneyland is clearly an A1, number one park in the same way. So in terms of the two companies working together, I can't see anything better than to have a marriage, and let's do this, let's figure out what we can do. And it was thought at that time it would go on and be a whole land, kind of like what's happened now, but this was back in 1984 and that we did this. And so it took a long time for that to happen. But anyway, so we came back, and I figured if that plane had gone down on the way home, it wouldn't have bothered me, because I just had the coolest day of my life up there. I just couldn't believe that this was happening, because it's what needed to happen, and it really looked like now it was going to happen. We were getting together with this guy who had his finger on what children and young people of that time loved, and that's what needed to be at Disneyland, And I tried to do a Robin Hood ride, I remember, from the animated film. And they said, what's wrong? Why are you having trouble with it? I said, because there's nothing to go to in the ride. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, it's either sticks and stones in the forest or rock walls at the castle, but there's no witches, there's no fairy tale worlds, there's no Pleasure Island, there's no jewel mine, there's no really great places that make rides special. So we were in a dilemma in terms of finding property. So this Star Wars, Indiana Jones potential thing was fantastic. So I came back, I went to work on the roller coaster ride, and I remember one scene when we were getting loaded. Imagine Space Mountain, where you're being loaded. We had the entire room of Dagobah. You were on Yoda's planet, and it was a giant elevator room with Yoda in it. And then Yoda looked out at the vehicle, which was being weighed there before it was launched, and he said, feel the force within you, it's strong with this group. And we lowered the entire room and Yoda, so it felt like the car was like raising up, and we thought that was a great idea. But then when you got out on the roller coaster, every time you put a choice on the roller coaster, it meant that you'd build twice as much track, and the building got twice as big. So very quickly we realized this is not going to be practical. And also, the world of Star Wars is limitless. It's outer space, and there's hyper warps, and you can go from this galaxy to that galaxy. And how would you do that in a building? And then a friend of mine who worked there, who had done all the Epcot films, his name was Randy Bright, they recorded the music for Epcot over in London, at London Philharmonic. And he said, well, I was coming back from London, and I went out to this place at Heathrow called Rediffusion, and they make industry simulators for the, for military and for training pilots in regular aircraft. And you really ought to go out and see that. I think it might be your answer. So immediately I called the park, and we got someone from maintenance and someone from operations at Disneyland. And we all got on a plane and went over there to Retta Fusion's office. It was about 20 minutes from Heathrow. And I remember we got into this clunky box and it took us 20 minutes to climb up a ladder and all this stuff. And they had jerry-rigged a roller coaster ride, which we found right away. The film that you create for a simulator has to be done to what the simulator can do. You can't just go out and film a movie and then put it in there and try to program it to do that, because there are limitations on what the simulation can actually achieve. So it was very much out of sync because they had just gone out and filmed a roller coaster and then tried to make their simulation fit it, which it didn't. So it was really easy to get sick. We found a lot of things out on that trip, but it was positive enough to know that here is a way that you can actually feel the sensations of being in the world of Star Wars or anything, and it's fairly compact. It's not like we were getting with the giant roller coaster with multiple tracks. It wasn't going to be a massive problem to build it. It was something that we could easily do in a fairly tight space. So I came back and I was really excited. So I told all our guys, let's put the roller coaster aside and let's start developing a scenario for this. And I went to management and they agreed to buy one because we needed to have one with us there at Imagineering so you could start to learn what it could do and what it can't do. And we created a Bible for it, myself and Bruce Gordon, who's my producer on it. He created a thing that said, if the simulator is doing this, you can't do that. Or if the simulator is doing this, you have these options. So it was a very solid thing that gave us a way of writing a script that was absolutely matched up to what it's very possible to do. And to give you an idea of that, when we had at a point in the ride, the original Star Tours exhausted all the energy in the hydraulics, so we really couldn't give you a thrill. We had to write a point into the story that gave you an excuse for that. So you heard the pilot go, uh-oh, we're caught in a tractor beam, we're being pulled up to a Star Destroyer. And then you heard the Darth Vader theme going dun, 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 dun. And all we could do was move you back in the seat so you're pushed hard against the back seat and you're pulled up into that Star Destroyer. And it was enough time to rebuild all the energy in the hydraulics. And then one of the other pilots comes on and goes, Star Tours, this is a restricted zone, get out of here. And they release us from the tractor beam, and then we're back into orbit. But a lot of mistakes that were done by people that rushed to copy using simulators for other theme parks and whatnot didn't go to that trouble. And so, sure enough, practically every one of those things that came and followed us, there were a lot in Las Vegas and all around the country, they all suffered from not creating films that matched perfectly the capabilities of the ride system. Even our own Body Wars in Florida violated a lot of the rules about keeping people from getting sick. We really had not very much trouble ever on Star Tours from people becoming bothered by the motion in it. And that was because we adhered to this Bible that we'd written, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so by then, the company had gone into a point where we thought we were going out of business. And there was no projects being sold at all. They just wanted us to stay even keeled. They'd opened Epcot in 82 and kept adding a few things during 83, and we were now in 84. And all of a sudden, Ron Miller was thrown out of control at the studio, taken out. They put a caretaker in there for a year, and then hired Michael Eisner and Frank Wells to take over. Ray Wallace was the interim head of the company for that year, but he had been given the task of just keep the place running, but don't do anything new. But then Michael and Frank came, and they had been tasked with reinventing the Disney company. So in their first week, they came to Imagineering. They went to Florida, they went to Disneyland, they went everywhere. And they said, we want to meet all of you. And when they came to Imagineering, they said, we understand filmmaking, we understand television, we do not understand how to do theme parks. So we're coming back on Saturday, and this was in September of in 1985. Just on the end of the first week they were there. So they came and they said, bring out all your projects. And I had two that were in work, Splash Mountain and Star Tours. And so we dusted off the models and got all the storyboards out. And Michael came in with Frank. And Michael had his young son. It was either, Breck was his name. He was either 12 or 14, I can't remember. And Michael said, I don't really go to theme parks. I'm going to learn about them, but my son goes all the time. So I thought, I've got a perfect person for the audience here. Why don't you present it to Breck, and then he'll tell me whether or not he thinks his generation would like it. And I remember thinking, my career depends on whether this 14-year-old likes my attraction or not. But then very, very quickly I realized, for the first time ever, I'm presenting to my audience rather than to a business guy or trying to make financial sense out of the thing rather than just the sheer enjoyment of the project. So I just let it go. And, I could see right away this kid was like Star Wars, and it's got star speeders and a new pilot and all this stuff. So I pitched it, and, I could just see he was eating it up. And he looked at his dad after I was finished, and he goes, Dad, that is so cool. You've got to do it. You've got to do it. And Michael okay, we're doing that. What else do you have? Just like that. And then I went into Splash Mountain, and I was a little worried that Splash would be hard to sell because it's got Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear and all that. And yet I talked about the steepest, tallest dips and whatnot in it. And at the end of that, Breck said, Dad, that is even cooler. I think that one's even cooler. So within a half an hour, I think I had two major projects that, suddenly were a go, and we had nothing up until that day. There was nothing going on, and now I had these two things. And then Michael said, okay, so does this open like next year or the year after, and how long till we open these? And management said, well, this isn't like a film. It'll take about 3 years for Star Wars and 5 years for Splash Mountain. And Michael about died. He goes, we have got to show the world that Disneyland is waking up. We can't wait 3 or 5 years. So he says, right there, he goes, get me Francis Ford Coppola, get George Lucas, and who's the hottest pop star around right now? And someone yelled out, Michael Jackson. He goes, okay, get Michael Jackson. And then he looked at all of us and he said, I know how to make films. You're going to have a film starring Michael Jackson, directed by Francis Coppola, produced by George Lucas, and it's going to open there in the summer of '86, a year later, And yes, sir, we'll do that. And so that was how Captain EO happened. So by the end of that day, we had 3 things in work, from none to 3. And then before he walked out, he said, and this summer, I want a teen dance facility down there, so it's cool again to go to Disneyland if you're over the age of 12, So we bought all the ruins from the '84 Olympics, all these really interesting structures they built in LA, and they were all on, for sale as junk. And we bought a whole set of them. We built this temporary place called Videopolis that opened about 4 months later. So we actually did have that. We did have Captain EO in '86, and Star Wars opened in '87. But now the whole story on Star Wars was interesting because I felt right away that, no simulators have been done. And so this is kind of a key thing. I felt we have to have a character with you on it. Otherwise, you're just watching a movie like in the theater. And that was a hard fight because it added weight. And of course, we have 4 simulators at Disneyland. We have 6 in Florida and 6 in Europe and 6 everywhere else. I think Disneyland has 4 because the park is smaller and we didn't have the room, and they didn't know whether it was going to be exciting yet because it was the first one. So they said, let's start small. But every star speeder has another figure, so you have to, double, triple, quadruple, 6 times as many figures. And so there was a gamble on doing that, and then hiding him behind a roll down, I felt that was really important. I said, you cannot walk into this spaceship and see a movie screen on the wall that's visible because the room is highly lit when you walk in for safety. And until we get the lighting turned down, I don't want anyone seeing that screen. So we had to put in like essentially a garage door that opens and closes. And everyone's going, you're adding so much weight to this thing, it's never gonna take off. And then of course you had a 70 millimeter projector on board. And I remember working with ILM, and we did a test in Las Vegas between 70 millimeter film and the state-of-the-art video at that time. And of course, the 70 millimeter film was way better. But Dennis Murin, who was the director on the film part of this, and myself, we both really liked the idea of gambling on video because it would give you the ability to change the ride out, with all different shows and whatnot. But we couldn't move anyone. So on board, in addition to the robot, in addition to the garage door, is a 70 millimeter projector with rolls of 70 millimeter film that are all in cabinets on the back end of that thing that have to move all around with motion. So the amazing thing is with all of that, it worked rather flawlessly. We never had a problem with the film getting tangled or scratched or anything like that. The film would fade out before it would get trashed from being eaten up or damaged by the projector. It was really well engineered. So that was on board. And then, like I said, aside from writing the Bible to make sure at this point in what the machine is doing, we can do these kind of actions. We also had a thing that I feel is really important that nobody else has really thought much about, is we made a catalog that there were 8 inputs that affected your emotions on this. Obviously, the motion of the simulator, the film, the sound effects, the music tracks, the onboard video monitor with other pilots on it, the robot, and a couple, I can't remember, there were 8 things. And I said it would be really easy if we don't choreograph all 8 of those inputs so that one of them is dominating and the others are all, submissive to that. So when I was describing to you about being pulled up into the Death Star by the tractor beam, I said, okay, the dominant thing there has to be the music from Darth Vader's theme. Dun, dun, dun. So you're not experiencing anything about the simulator. You're not feeling any motion. The movie is rather static at that point. It's that ominous theme. And then for 1 second later in the show, when we're going into the ice droid sequence, we had a moment where you hear just the safety bell in the airplane thing, that ting, that you hear, and you see all the stewardesses scurrying on the airplane to sit and buckle their seats, and your heart is pounding like that. I said, that's one of the most frightening noises on the planet, that little ting. And I said, so let's put that in just before we go into this really scary sequence. So we had it was almost like a emotional script that showed you what thing was literally affecting your journey. Now, obviously, a lot of it was the motion. I remember at one point, Dennis Murin, who was doing the film work on it, he had come up with a new thing to replace the trench shot. And when I saw the Star Wars movies over and over again, this first Star Wars, A New Hope, the element that I just sat in my theater seat going, I wish I could experience that, was the hyperspace warp, and then Luke taking that dramatic curve down into the trench on the Death Star, and then it kind of leveled out and went like that. And so we got down almost to the first run through of the rough cut, and Dennis had decided to do something different. And I said, you've got a good piece in there, but I really wanted to have that thing, that it's in there. He goes, well, we don't want to do something we've already filmed. That's boring to us. We want to try and do something new. Because every shot in the ride was new. A lot of people thought, we used footage from Star Wars, but we didn't. It's all new. And it's essentially one continuous shot. And the only way they had to cut away, because you can't go to the close-up of Han Solo or anything, it's just the window, and you're looking out the window the entire 4.5 minutes. So the only thing they could do is an explosion or shattering the ice at the end of the ice droid, and it breaks, and that gives you a chance to get off of a model onto another matte painting or another model or something. So it was very, very difficult for them to essentially create one shot. So we would find these moments where we could literally lay out whether the motion base was going to dominate. So we fought on this trench shot idea. Dennis wanted his new idea. I wanted the old, reliable trench shot. And Dennis finally just said, look, I want it my way, you want it your way. If you want to try and get it to be different, then you're going to have to sell George on the idea. So this was really awkward because I was pitted against someone I admired. I mean, Dennis Muren is a genius, and he's literally reinvented the film industry with what he came up with, Jurassic Park and the digital CG dinosaurs and whatnot. So here I am arguing with him, and George Lucas is the judge. We're sitting in the ride, and I said, I just think your audience needs a couple of things that they've seen in your movies that just are what those movies are defined by. The hyperwarp, of going through hyperwarp, the way you tease it in the second and third film where yin, 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 it doesn't quite go, and everyone's sitting there going, here we go, and no, you don't get it. I said, so you know that. And I said, and the other one is that shot where everybody in the audience is saying, I'm with this kid, I want to do that. And so I finished my pitch, and Dennis did his, and then George goes, well, I really like what you've done, Dennis. The new one is really great, but I kind of agree with Tony. So I'm sitting there going, he'll never talk to me again, and anyway, so I added the dialogue in there that said, that our little Rex, the pilot, goes, I've always wanted to do this, and he goes down here, because I honestly think every single person in the audience, when we opened that, was sitting there having that same sensation. I've always wanted to do this and feel what it's like to peel off on that thing and then careen down the trench. So, it became a beautifully, I think, choreographed piece, because we were conscious every moment of the time, like what was affecting your emotional engagement by that show, whether it was the obvious thing like feeling the ship rocking back and forth, or lighting effects that were embedded in the set, or it's the robot with his dialogue, I've always wanted to do this, or I meant to do that. I remember all the little quirks that Paul Rubens did for us in that. He ad-libbed a lot, and we were able to pick up little bites and things that made it very humorous. And the fact that we took people to worlds they'd never seen before was risky, because we weren't sure where we stood. We were walking in eggshells about having any of the name talent, Harrison and Carrie and Mark, they all came to ride on the thing there and see it, but the deal wasn't negotiated to, we were small potatoes compared to Hollywood, so we had to find ways to invent other characters. And I think what's been encouraging to me is that now here we are, gosh, we're 87, 97, 107, 32 years since it opened. There are toys of the Star Speeder, there are toys of Rex the robot. Rex is now the DJ in the cantina in the new Galaxy's Edge. So those characters, even though they were only associated with an amusement park, they've kind of become iconic in their own right, that they're embedded into the collective consciousness of everybody that went on it. And that's a hard thing to do, to compete with a beautifully scripted film that's hours long, where your heart is embedded with these three adventurers, like in Star Wars, the three I've mentioned. In Harry Potter, you've got Hermione and Ron and Harry. That's critical, but in a ride, you've only got like 4 minutes to meet these characters. But I think we did a great job of that, and you leverage what you can. So you have the John Williams music working on you as you go through the queue for 20 minutes, and you have 3PO in the load area and R2D2, and R2 is with you in their flight. So there are these touchstones that make it legitimate. So everybody felt they were on a legitimate Star Wars experience, but nothing had ever been done like that. So when we opened, I remember the opening day, essentially what you had was a new Star Wars film, several years after there hadn't been any Star Wars films, that was only playing in one theater in the entire world. And so I don't think the park ever understood that demand, that you have all these hungry fans that want the next episode. And Disneyland is saying, hey, if you want to not only see the next episode, but get on the ship and experience it, come on out. So, of course, they got so many people that they had a session in the administration building. They said, what are we going to do? So they decided to leave the park open for 60 hours and not close. So it was a 5-hour line to get on it, and you would think people would be angry and anything but positive if they were interviewed after waiting 5 hours for a 5-minute experience, but it was just the opposite. People had never seen anything like that. I remember one woman said, that must be the largest facility you have at Disneyland. It must be enormous. So the whole effect of having gone on this epic outer space journey, she completely bought it, hook, line, and sinker. And so we just said, okay to the press, you guys can go in and interview the people coming off the rides if you want to. And I think a lot of people were freed from the thought of we're wasting 5 hours of our time at Disneyland. They were kind of caught up in the fact that we can stay at Disneyland for 3 days, so some of us will go home and rest while the others are in line again. And so that's how it kind of went for that whole time. And there was just a jubilation because it wasn't like a pirate ride or a haunted mansion. It was something that was absolutely cinematic and gave you the same, experience visually that you got in going to a movie, but you were experiencing it, you were feeling it, you were part of it. And so it was a breakthrough. And I knew when we did it that it was a fairly reasonable attraction to buy these things and put them in malls and put them, as if you're old enough to remember that, there were things in just about every mall where you could pay $5 and pick a 16mm film and the guy would put it in and it would rock you back and forth. I knew that was going to happen. So the critical thing wasn't just that we had the first simulator in a theme park. It was that it was Star Wars and that these characters are a part of the collective memory of growing up and what it's like to be a child and all of that. So when the bloom wears off of it being a simulator ride, it is Star Wars. And as you go into it, you're not thinking about any more than you're thinking about Snow White as a cart ride and Pirates as a boat ride. You're not thinking about that. You're thinking it's pirates and it's Snow White and it's Star Wars. And that was the edge that we had. And I really don't think that 32 years later, there are many simulator rides from that vintage that are still running. So it's not the simulation. We've all learned how that feels and how it's done and all that, but it's a chance to be young again and meet up with all these characters that were so much a part of your life and these experiences and the music and the thrill of a world that's long ago and far away. So I think that's sort of the legacy of why it works, and the fact that even with the new, Galaxy's Edge area, the lines are still very long for Star Tours. So there was talk about, well, it needs to go away, now that we're moving on into something much more immersive. But there's a lot of reasons to keep it there, at least for the near term. So I think you're not going to see it go away. In fact, I believe they're adding a new segment for it to coincide with the final 9th film in the series, which will be coming up somewhere in the fall, being put in there. So